Sunday dinner was supposed to be our family time, but that night, the moment I reached for my chair at the big table, my son put his hand on my shoulder and pushed it back, smiling in front of his friends as he said that I could not sit there because they were recording something for their social media, and I would make it awkward. And before I could understand what was happening, his wife laughed and told me I was too embarrassing to sit on camera with them, that I did not even know how to hold a fork the way they liked, while their friends smirked and pretended not to stare at me, standing there in my own house with the good plates and cloth napkins I had set out. My face grew hot. My heart felt like it had dropped into my shoes, and for a moment I almost said I was sorry, as if I had done something wrong by wanting a place at my own table. But the words stuck in my throat and I stepped back toward the corner instead, holding on to the edge of the chair so my hands would not shake. Just then, my phone buzzed on the counter beside the stove, where I had been keeping an eye on the peach cobbler. And while everyone at the table was laughing for the camera and talking over one another, I glanced at the screen and saw the name that changed everything for me that night. A name they did not recognize, and they had no idea what kind of message had just arrived for the woman they thought was only good for cooking and staying out of their way. Thank you for staying with me and listening to my story. It means more to me than you know. And before I go any further, I would love it if you could tell me in the comments where you are watching from, because even though I cannot see your faces, it comforts me to imagine the different kitchens and living rooms where my voice is reaching. My name is Edna. I live in Alaska, and even after all these years, I am still getting used to how quiet a house can feel when the snow is piled up outside the windows, and there is no one sitting across from you at the table. Just a cup of tea growing cold and a clock that sounds too loud. And as I stand there in my own kitchen on that Sunday evening with my phone buzzing beside the peach cobbler, I am not just a woman being pushed away from a chair. I am a woman with a whole life behind her that nobody in that dining room bothered to remember. Before that message lit up my screen, I had spent decades believing that Sunday dinners were sacred. I grew up watching my own mother lay out plates and food like a prayer, teaching me that you show love with your hands and your time and not just with gifts or fancy words. And when I was younger and my son was small, those same Sunday meals used to be filled with his laughter and crumbs on the floor and sticky fingers reaching for one more piece of chicken. Back then, the table felt like the safest place in the world. I worked hard in this cold corner of the country, taking whatever work I could find, saving every extra dollar in envelopes, learning slowly how to make that money grow so that one day I would not be completely at the mercy of anyone. And while the world outside changed, while people started pointing little screens at their plates instead of bowing their heads to give thanks, I kept my old ways because they reminded me of who I was. Standing there that night with my son and his friends at the big table and me shunted off to the side like an extra chair, I realized just how far apart we had grown. They saw me as someone who did not know how to pose for their videos. But the name waiting on that message in my phone belonged to a man who had spoken to me with respect for years, who knew exactly how much my life was worth in numbers they had never even imagined. And as I picked up that phone, my heart was breaking. But at the same time, something inside me was finally waking up. As I stood there with that phone still warm in my hand, it pulled me backwards through time in a way. Because before there was ever a message from a bank or a number with so many zeros it almost made my head spin. There was just a young woman named Edna, who believed that if she worked hard, kept her word, and loved her family with everything she had, life would eventually be kind. And for a while it seemed like that might be true. I remember bringing my son home from the hospital all those years ago, the air outside so cold it burned my lungs while I carried him in a second-hand blanket, and promised myself I would make sure he never felt the kind of hunger and fear I knew as a girl. I took on every job I could find, cleaning offices before sunrise, folding laundry in other people's houses, cooking in a small diner where the coffee smelled burnt most days, but the tips were just enough to fill one more envelope in the drawer by my bed. My husband and I did not have much, but we had this stubborn belief that we could build something if we were careful. So when a tired old commercial building on the edge of town went up for sale, with crooked stairs and leaking pipes, everyone said it was a foolish idea. They told us it would swallow our savings and leave us worse off. But my husband ran his rough hand over the cracked banister and said he could feel possibility in the wood, and I believed him. We signed papers in a small office that smelled like ink and dust, and that is where I first met the young man who would later become Mr. Glover, the bank leader whose name looked so calm and confident on my phone screen that night. Back then, he was just another worker in a suit that did not quite fit his shoulders. But when he sat across from me and my husband noticed how nervous I was about signing such a big loan, he did not speak down to me or rush me. He took the time to explain each line, each number, in words I could understand. And when I asked the same question twice, because I was afraid of missing something, he answered again without a hint of impatience. It was the first time I had ever sat in a bank and felt like a person instead of a problem. Over the years, while I mopped floors and cooked meals and watched that rundown building slowly fill up with tenants, I would go back to that bank with small payments, sometimes with only a little extra to put away. And that same man would greet me by my name, not the name on the account, but the way I said it, like I mattered. He would ask me about the weather out by our home, about how business was, and he would always end by telling me I was doing well, that my discipline was something to be proud of, and I would walk out clutching my receipt like a tiny certificate of survival. At home, my son grew taller, his legs outgrowing his pants faster than I could mend them. He would do homework at the corner of the kitchen table while I went over the bills, and I would look at his bowed head and think, one day this will all be for him. The house, the building, the security we never had. And in those moments I could not imagine a future where that same boy would treat me like an interruption instead of a blessing. Time has a way of slipping. Seasons changed, my husband's hair went gray, and then one day he was simply not there anymore, taken by a quiet ache in his chest that never let him wake up. And I found myself alone at the table, his chair empty, the mortgage and the tenants and the envelopes now entirely my responsibility. I kept going because I did not know how to do anything else. And in every meeting after that, when I sat across from Mr. Glover, he would soften his voice just a little when he asked how I was holding up, encouraging me to keep the property in my name, reminding me gently that I was more capable than I felt. Meanwhile, my son grew into a man who moved further and further away from the life that built him. His clothes changed, his words changed. He stopped asking me how I was managing and started talking about projects and content and followers. Words that meant nothing to me, except that they seemed to matter more to him than the hands that had tucked him in as a boy. I brushed off the first jokes from his wife about my old recipes and my old ways, laughing along so I would not seem sensitive, telling myself that every generation thinks it knows better than the one before. But somewhere deep inside me, a small voice had already started whispering that my heart might not be safe in their hands. Now, in that kitchen, with my name glowing back at me from the phone beside the peach cobbler and the noise of their laughter rolling from the dining room, that small voice was no longer a whisper. It was a steady knowing, reminding me that the story of my life was written in more than their careless words. It was written in signatures on property deeds and in tired feet that had walked to work for decades, in quiet bank visits where a respectful man learned my face and my history. And as I stood there, I realized I needed to tell this whole story to you, not just the part where I was pushed away, but the part where I finally remembered who I was. When I think about how everything ended up in that kitchen, I have to go back to the day my son first threw my front door. Because at the beginning, I wanted so badly to like her. I remember smoothing my dress, wiping my hands on a towel, and telling myself to keep an open mind. I had worked too hard and loved too long to start off by judging the person he chose to stand beside him. She walked in with a bright smile and a perfume that drowned out the smell of the chicken I was roasting. Her hair and nails were perfect. Her phone was in her hand more than it was in her purse. And when I reached out to hug her, she leaned in just enough to be polite, but not enough to leave a mark on her makeup. I noticed that, but I told myself it was just nerves, that people show warmth in different ways now. And I pushed the little ache in my chest aside as I set an extra plate on the table. The first few Sundays after they married, I tried to make meals that felt welcoming to both of them. I watched her pick at the mashed potatoes like they were something strange. I heard her say quietly that everything felt heavy and old-fashioned. And every time she made a little comment about how her own family did things differently, my son would laugh and look at her the way he used to look at his favorite dessert, like she was something special. And for a while I swallowed my pride and told myself that my job was not to compete, only to support. But it is hard to ignore it when you see your own plate being pushed a little further away each time. There were small moments that should have warned me, like the first time she took out her phone while I was telling them how I met his father, tapping and scrolling while I spoke, nodding at the wrong parts, or the day she asked if we could move the table closer to the window, because the light would make their pictures look better. And I watched them spend more time deciding which angle to use than tasting the food I had been stirring since morning. And when I tried to share a memory, she told me with a sweet smile that maybe I should save long stories for another time because they needed to get their recording done before the light changed. My son stopped asking how I was managing the bills or the cold Alaskan winters and started asking if he could bring extra people to dinner so they could film reactions to my cooking. He said it like a compliment, as if I should be grateful to be part of their content. But every time someone laughed more at my accent or my old expressions than at the joke he was supposedly making, something inside me folded in on itself a little more. It is a strange thing to watch your life be turned into a background for someone else's performance. I tried talking to him once, very gently, standing by the sink as he dried his hands, telling him that sometimes the way she spoke to me in front of others made me feel small. And he sighed like I was giving him extra work. He told me I was reading too much into things, that she was just joking, that I needed to learn to take it, and for peace I nodded. But when he walked away, I realized it was not just her I was losing. It was the boy who used to tug at my sleeve and beg me to sit down and eat beside him instead of hovering over the stove. All those memories were sitting just under my skin that night, when my phone lit up with the name of the bank leader who had seen me grow into a woman who could sign off on a 7-figure transfer without asking anyone's permission. And I knew that if I did not listen to what my own heart was telling me now, I would spend whatever years I had left trying to win back a place at a table where I was only ever one camera angle away from being cut out. After that talk by the sink, where my son brushed off my feelings like crumbs from a plate, things did not change for the better. They simply settled into a new kind of normal, where I learned to fall quiet faster. And the people who came through my door learned that it was easy to laugh a little louder whenever I tried to speak. But there was one person who seemed to notice the way my shoulders drooped after they left. My granddaughter, who would sometimes stay behind while the others hurried out to catch better light for their next recording. She would help me stack plates and wrap leftovers, and she asked me real questions. Not just the kind you ask so you can talk about yourself again. She wanted to hear how I met her grandfather, how I managed after he passed, how I kept the house warm through those long Alaskan winters when the power bill seemed higher than the sky. I saw the way her eyes tightened whenever her father or stepmother cut me off in conversation, and she would squeeze my hand under the table in a quiet apology that she never put into words. It was like having one small candle in a room where the rest of the lights kept burning me instead of warming me. And those evenings when it was just the two of us rinsing dishes, I found myself telling her little pieces of the truth about the building her grandfather and I had bought, about the polite young man at the bank who was no longer young, about how every visit to sign a paper reminded me that I was still capable of making decisions for myself. I never told her the numbers or the full plan. But speaking those memories out loud to someone who actually listened made it easier for me to see that my life was bigger than the narrow way I was being treated at that table. And somewhere in those quiet talks with her drying dishes and me wiping down the same old countertops, the idea began to grow in my mind that I did not have to keep giving all of myself to people who only saw me as useful when the camera was off and the food was hot. Once that small idea took root, that I did not have to keep pouring my strength into a place where my heart was not safe. It did not grow with fireworks, it grew quietly. The way ice forms along the edge of a window, slow but certain. And one afternoon after my granddaughter had gone home, and the house had settled into that soft silence I know too well, I put on my warm coat, wrapped a scarf around my neck, and took the bus into town instead of going straight home from the grocery store like I usually did. I walked through the doors of the bank that had watched me age. And there he was, the same man who had once explained loan papers to a nervous young wife. Only now his hair was thinner and his title was much bigger. When Mr. Glover saw me, he stood up from his desk, came around to shake my hand, and called me Edna, in that respectful tone that always reminded me I was not invisible. I sat down across from him, and for the first time, I did not just ask about interest rates or renewal dates. I asked what it would mean to move everything, the building, the savings, all the pieces of my life's work, into a safer place under my own control. Something that could support me if I chose to live somewhere I did not have to flinch at every joke, and perhaps help causes I believed in when I was gone. He listened without interrupting, his pen resting still on the paper, instead of scratching numbers while I spoke, and when I finally mentioned, in careful words, that my home life had become heavy, and I needed to make sure no one could pressure me into decisions that were not truly mine, he did not pry or demand details. He simply nodded and said that many people reached a point where they needed to protect themselves, that it was not selfish, it was wise. We spent that hour setting up the structure of a new account in my name, one that could be turned into a foundation later. And he told me about a senior community not far from town that some of his other older clients spoke well of. A place with big windows, shared dining rooms, and staff who actually learned your name and your favorite dessert. A week later I went to see it, walking through hallways where women my age sat together playing cards and laughing in voices that did not apologize for taking up space. I saw a group gathered around a table, not for a video, but just to swap stories, passing rolls and soup without anyone pushing another person away. And as I stood there listening to their easy chatter, part of me I thought had gone to sleep with my husband stirred again. I went back to the bank and told Mr. Glover I wanted to be ready, that if I decided to step away from the house and the table I had built, I wanted the path to already be laid out. He promised to prepare everything, and he wrote his direct number on a card in case I needed him outside regular hours. I slipped that card into my wallet, behind a picture of my younger self holding my boy in front of this same house. And as I rode the bus home through the gray Alaskan streets, grocery bag at my feet, I knew that the next time someone tried to push me out of my own place, I would not be standing there empty-handed. I would be standing there with a choice. That next time came sooner than I expected. It slipped into my week, disguised as a simple message from my son, asking if they could come over for Sunday dinner and bring a few friends. The kind of request that used to make my heart jump with happiness before it started to make my stomach twist. He wrote that they wanted something classic for their new video. My cooking, their reactions, and even though the word made me feel more like a prop than a person, I said yes, because old habits do not disappear in a day. And a part of me still hoped that if I tried hard enough, I might see a glimpse of the boy who once sat at this table, kicking his heels against the chair while he asked for seconds. All week I moved through the house with a strange mix of calm and sadness. I took the good plates down from the cabinet and ran a cloth over them. I washed the cloth napkins and ironed them until every crease was sharp. I went to the store and picked out the best chicken I could afford, the potatoes that reminded me of dinners with my husband, the peaches that would soften into a cobbler, the way my mother taught me back when my hands were young and quick. And the whole time I was cooking, I kept hearing Mr. Glover's steady voice in my mind, telling me that I had options now, that my life did not have to shrink down to whether or not I was allowed to sit at a table I had paid for. That Sunday, the sky over Alaska was its usual pale gray, the kind that makes the kitchen light feel warmer than it really is. I moved from stove to counter, with the quiet rhythm my body still remembered, tasting the gravy, adjusting the seasoning, straightening the daisies in the little vase in the center of the table, and with each small task I felt myself standing a little taller inside. Not because I expected them to suddenly treat me differently, but because I knew that whatever happened this time, I was not trapped in it the way I once had been. When their car finally pulled up and I heard the front door burst open with laughter and the familiar sound of hurried footsteps and phone notifications, I wiped my hands on my apron, took a slow breath, and reminded myself that this might be their content. But it was still my home, my food, and my story. And I was no longer just the woman waiting to see where they decided I fit. I was the one quietly holding the power to decide where I would go next. They came into the house in a rush of cold air and noise. My son calling out a quick hello without even taking his eyes off his phone, while his wife swept past me with a bright smile that did not touch her eyes, talking loudly to their friends about angles and lighting, as if my kitchen were a stage they had rented for the evening. And I stood there for a moment, holding my dish towel, watching them circle the table I had laid so carefully, moving the vase of daisies to one side because it blocked their little stand, turning plates so they looked better for the camera, instead of thinking about who would be eating from them. My son glanced at the roast chicken, the mashed potatoes, the cobbler cooling on the counter, and instead of saying it smelled good the way he used to as a boy, he asked if I could move a few things so there would be more space at the end of the table where they planned to sit together and talk to their audience. And I felt that familiar sting in my chest, but I nodded, because for so many years my first instinct had always been to make things easier for him. When it was finally time to sit, I walked toward my usual chair, the one I had filled on every Sunday from the time he was small. But before I could pull it out, his hand came down on my shoulder, not rough but firm, and he said with a forced little laugh that they needed that side for filming with their friends, that I should sit at the small table by the wall where I would still be close but not on camera. And as he gently steered me away, I could hear his wife telling their guests that I got nervous around technology and that it was better if I was not in the main shot. Her tone light, but her words sharp enough to scrape the inside of my heart. Their friends shifted in their seats, some looking at their phones, one of them giving me an awkward smile before looking away. And I felt my face grow hot, my throat tight, my hands suddenly too aware of the way the years had changed them. I pulled out the little chair in the corner and sat down, close enough to smell the food I had spent the day cooking, far enough that I might as well have been in another room, listening to them laugh and perform for people I could not see. For a brief second, I almost heard myself say I was sorry for getting in the way, sorry for not understanding their world, as if I were a guest who had overstayed a visit instead of the woman who had scrubbed these floors and paid these bills. But the apology stuck behind my teeth. And in that heavy quiet inside my own head, I realized how many times I had swallowed my hurt for the sake of keeping peace that never truly included me. While they adjusted the camera and checked the sound on their little device, my eyes drifted back toward the counter where my phone lay next to the peach cobbler, its screen suddenly lighting up with a new message. And even from across the room, I could see the first letters of the name on it. The name of the one person in this town who spoke to me as if my years had added to my value instead of subtracting from it. And in that instant, before I even picked it up, a thin line formed in my mind between the way I was being treated at that table and the life I had quietly built outside this house. A line that told me the moment I chose to cross it, everything would change. I pushed my chair back from that little table in the corner and walked slowly toward the counter, as if I were just checking on the cobbler, wiping my hands on my apron to steady the shaking that had nothing to do with the cold. The laughter from the big table rose and fell behind me, but it sounded far away, like a television in another room, while all my attention narrowed down to that small rectangle of light beside the warm dish I had baked. I picked up the phone and turned it toward me, and there it was. His name just as I had saved it. Not the formal title he carried in the world, but the simple version my tired fingers had typed in all those years ago. The one that reminded me he was a person I trusted, not just a signature on bank letters. I opened the message and read the words slowly, letting each one land. Wire transfer of $2,400,000 to your new foundation account is complete. Congratulations. I stood very still, the heat from the cobbler rising around my wrist while the numbers on the screen pulled up every memory of long shifts, aching feet, signed papers, and careful prayers. It was not luck sitting there in my hand. It was my life's work, distilled into a line of text. My husband's faith in that old building, my own stubbornness each time I carried another payment into the bank. My decision to protect myself when I realized love at home had turned into something thin and sharp that cut more than it comforted. As I read the message again, the humiliation from a few minutes before did not disappear, but it changed shape. It stopped feeling like proof that I was small and started feeling more like a final warning that I had stayed in a place where I was not respected for far too long. I glanced over my shoulder at the table where my son and his wife were leaning into their camera with practiced smiles, talking about how grateful they were for family, while the woman who had cooked their meal sat half in the shadows. And in that moment, I saw the gap between the way they spoke to strangers online and the way they treated me when they thought no one important was watching. I looked back at the phone, at the calm congratulations from the man who had treated me with quiet dignity since the first day I signed my name on a loan form, and I felt something inside me settle, like a door closing gently but firmly. I slipped the phone into my hand, wiped my eyes with the back of my wrist so I would not go to them, looking as if I were begging for kindness. And I understood that the next words I spoke would not be for their camera. They would be for me. A signal that I was finally choosing to step out of the corner they had pushed me into and walk toward a different future I had already prepared. One signature and one hard-earned dollar at a time. I walked back toward the table with the phone held loosely in my hand, feeling that strange mix of hurt and calm that can only come when a heart finally decides it is done begging for a place it already earned. My son was in the middle of some practiced speech to his audience, smiling into the little lens propped up by the salt shaker. His wife tilting her head just so while their friends laughed on cue. And for a moment, none of them seemed to see me standing there at the edge of their perfect frame. Then I stepped a little closer and his wife glanced up, her smile flickering with annoyance before she smoothed it over, and my son gave me that quick, impatient look I knew too well. The one that said he thought I was about to interrupt something more important than his own mother. I took a breath that reached all the way down to the years in my bones and said in a steady voice that I needed to take an important call. Not loud, not dramatic, just clear enough that it cut through their chatter. He rolled his eyes and asked if it could wait because they were filming. His words light but his tone sharp as he reminded me that this was their shot, their moment, as if my whole evening had been nothing but a backdrop for it. I felt the old habit rise in me to apologize and step back, to say I would stay quiet and small a little longer, but I held on to the memory of that message and everything behind it. And I shook my head. I told him this call would decide where I spent the rest of my life, so it could not wait. I did not explain that the rest of my life no longer depended on being invited to his table, only on the choices I was finally ready to make. Before anyone could joke or argue, I reached for my purse on the hook by the door, slipping the strap over my shoulder with hands that had washed his clothes and packed his lunches and paid his bills when he was too young to even know what those words meant. I did not slam the door or raise my voice. I simply opened it and stepped out into the cold Alaskan air, letting their laughter and their bright lights stay behind me in the house I had kept warm for so many winters. In the quiet of the car, I set the phone on my lap for a moment, looking at my reflection in the dark window. An older woman with tired eyes who still deserved better than to be treated like a joke. Then I scrolled to the number that had carried me through so many careful decisions and pressed it, listening to the ring cut through the silence, my heart beating slow and sure. When Mr. Glover answered, his voice calm and respectful, saying my name like it mattered, I told him I had received his message, that I was ready to finish what we had started. He did not ask why my voice sounded a little tight around the edges. He just said he could meet me, that the papers were ready whenever I was, and as I turned the key in the ignition and pulled away from the house without looking back, I understood that this was the moment my story turned. Not because my son had changed, but because I finally had. Driving through the quiet Alaskan streets that night, snow piled up in tired mounds along the sidewalks and the sky already dark, even though dinner time was not far behind me, I felt strangely steady, my hands firm on the wheel as if they had finally remembered that they belonged to me and not to everyone who needed something from me. When I reached the bank, the lights inside were still on, and as I stepped through the doors, I saw Mr. Glover waiting. Coat over his arm, papers neatly stacked on his desk as if he already knew I would choose myself tonight. He greeted me with that same calm respect he had always shown, saying my name slowly, and I sat down across from him. No longer the nervous young wife from years ago, but a woman who had lived enough life to know the cost of ignoring her own needs. He slid the documents toward me, explaining each one in plain words, confirming that the sale of the old building was complete, that the money sat safely in the new foundation account in my name, that arrangements were ready for me to move if and when I decided to leave the house that no longer felt like a home. And with every signature my hand made on those pages, I felt a little more of the weight I had been carrying for my son fall away. When we finished, he asked if I wanted to see the senior community again in the coming days, and I told him that I had already been picturing it on the drive over. The wide windows letting in weak winter light, the shared dining room where women my age laughed loud without anyone filming them or pushing their chairs to the side. The thought of sitting at a table where my presence was expected and welcomed, not treated like an inconvenience, wrapped around my heart like a warm shawl, and I knew then that what had felt like a distant idea was now becoming the next chapter of my life. I left the bank with a folder under my arm and a small map in my bag, stepping back into the crisp night air. And as I walked to my car, I realized that for the first time in a very long time, my future was not tied to whether or not my son decided I was worthy of sitting beside him. It was tied to the choices I had finally made for myself. Choices written in ink instead of tears. And later, when I sat alone at my own kitchen table with a simple cup of tea and the remains of that untouched cobbler cooling beside me, the house quiet and my phone face down, I felt pain. Yes, but also a thin, steady line of peace running through it. Because I knew that whatever storms were coming once he discovered what I had done, my foundation, both in the bank and in my heart, was no longer resting on his approval. It did not take long for the storm to arrive. Later that same night, my phone buzzed on the table, its harsh sound cutting through the quiet as my son's name flashed on the screen. And when I answered, he did not ask if I had reached home safely or if I was all right. He went straight into anger, demanding to know why I had walked out, telling me his friends thought it was rude, complaining that the dishes were still on the table, and that they had to wrap up their video without me, as if my absence were nothing more than an inconvenience to his plans. I listened until his words ran out of breath, and then I told him, very softly, that I had walked away from more than the table, that I was tired of being pushed aside in my own house and spoken about like a prop instead of a person. He huffed and muttered that I was being dramatic, and we ended the call with a silence that felt heavier than any argument. A few days later, the tone of his voice had changed. This time it shook when he called. He had been to the bank. He had learned that the building was sold, that the accounts were no longer open for him to lean on, that his name was not where he thought it would be, and he asked me what I had done, how I could make decisions like that without telling him. How I could forget that he was family. I let him finish, then I reminded him of that Sunday dinner, of his hand on my shoulder, of his wife's words about me being too embarrassing to sit with them, of all the little ways they had shown me my place was in the corner. And I told him that I had finally believed them. I said that if I was too much for their table, then my life's work was too much for their pockets. That what your hands and heart build does not have to be handed to anyone who treats you like a burden. I did not shout or argue. I simply told him the truth, that I had chosen to leave what I could to causes that healed rather than harmed. And to the one granddaughter who still sat beside me without needing an audience. And when he fell quiet on the other end of the line, I felt the ache of a mother who knew she might have just lost her son, in a way deeper than distance. But beneath that ache, there was a steady certainty that for once, I had not betrayed myself to keep peace that never truly included me. In the end, I did move, not in anger, but in quiet acceptance. I packed my life into a few sturdy boxes, left the old house with its memories and its worn floorboards, and walked into that senior community with the big windows and the warm dining room. The place where the tables are set not for show but for company, where no one shoves your chair away because you have lines on your face or stories that take a little longer to tell. Now, I sit some evenings with other women my age. We share soup and cards and laughter that does not have to be edited or approved. And even though there is still an ache when I think of how my son chose a camera over respect, that pain does not own me anymore. It is just part of a story that also holds strength and hard-earned peace. I talk to my granddaughter when she visits. We sit on a simple bench, and she tells me about school and her own hopes, her eyes soft when she listens to my side of things. And I feel grateful that at least one branch of my family tree still reaches toward me with kindness instead of toward my bank account. I know there may come a day when my son feels the full weight of what he traded away for a handful of views and quick laughs. And if that day comes, I will listen. But I will not hand back the power I fought so late in life to claim. Because I have learned that love without respect is not love at all. It is just need dressed up as affection. If you are hearing my voice and you have ever been told you are too embarrassing, too much, too old, or too inconvenient to sit at a table you helped build, please remember this. You are allowed to stand up, you are allowed to walk away, you are allowed to protect what your hands and heart have created. Even if the person hurting you shares your last name, your value is not measured by how quietly you can endure disrespect. It is measured by the courage you find to finally say that you deserve better. Thank you for staying with me all the way to the end of my story. It means more to me than I can ever put into words. And if my truth touched your heart today, please subscribe so we can spend more time together in the next story. I would be honored to have you back with me again.